So we have some time for some questions. I guess I will probably sort of call on people. Could you keep the questions kind of short, and also name the people who you'd like to hear answers from. Yes.
I have some observations I'd like to share with you based on my life's experiences. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I graduated from the University of Iowa College of Medicine in 1958. Now that obviously was 50 years ago. I practiced medicine for 40 of those 50 years. Obviously then I was an observer, a front-line observer of the scene. I've also been a hospital trustee. I've been a director of the State Medical Society. And issues that I see are critical to our health care are not rarely discussed. And anybody can address this, but the number one issue as I see it is waste. We have tremendous waste in our delivery of health care. And the waste is not only economic, but we also waste an awful lot of our human capital. And we have administrative waste, we have clinical waste, and I say we have human capital waste. The other word that I think that categorizes or explains the mess we're in is unipolar or unidirectional incentives. The incentives in our healthcare system are all driving in one direction. Dr. Reinhardt mentioned the care of his father with pancreatic cancer. He was responding to the emotional incentives of the situation. However, the best thing for his father was what happened. But rarely is that position taken in our system. The emotional incentives drive our system almost into a frenzy. So I'd like to hear you comment on those two key words, waste and unipolar or unidirectional incentives. Anybody?
Well, they're thinking of really intelligent things to say. I'll start. Actually, waste is brought up a lot. Certainly during the 1990s healthcare reform, and I was engaged with that before it really got into the Clinton period. There was a lot of discussion about waste in both economic and human capital terms. In fact, it became the easy device. We all know there's a lot of waste in the system. Arnold Relman was constantly quoted as saying there's half the things we do are not effective. And the problem always came down to this. No one really knew how to identify the things that systematically that weren't working well to recapture that. Or you go to Wenberg's data, which are unbelievably significant and important, but we don't really have a way of identifying where in that range from the lowest cost to the highest cost is the right one. We don't, and it's. I guess
my challenge is basically then, why don't we know how to deal with waste? The rest of our society deals with waste, and almost every other activity, well, not every activity, but certainly the commercial world deals with waste. So why don't we know how to deal with waste?
Go ahead, you go first.
Okay, well, I think in part, the incentive for going after waste have never really been there. I remember some years ago in the Wall Street Journal, a general who had been in charge of procurement for the Pentagon came flat out and said 30% of all defense spending is waste. But he said, I don't know how to get at it without cutting into the flesh. Because sometimes what you think ex ante is waste turns out later to be very useful. And you have that in health too. Avastin is basically for terminally ill people, but it can also be used for the eyes, and you don't know that. So there could be that uncertainty, but I believe in the case of healthcare and defense, the same thing. There is a huge constituency with equity shares in the Congress that lives off defense. And cutting defense spending is just not something Congress likes to do. And the same is true in healthcare, because you really do have to ask yourself, and Mark, as a political scientist, may be able to answer that. Wenberg has personally presented these data in the most beautiful conceivable shape to the Congress that every layperson could understand it. And not once has Congress said, we're going to mandate the Agency for Healthcare Research, ARC, to spend $2 million to figure out what goes on here. The only institution that did was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that paid Elliot Fisher and others, and they discovered it seems not to have much effect on outcome as we can measure it, but they also didn't go into the nuts and bolts. What you'd really like to do is, how does a typical heart attack get treated in the Sun Belt versus Minnesota? You could do this kind of research with clinicians, and no one in society has done it. Now, why do private insurers not do it? If you actually think of their incentive, they take 5% of the book of business. The more flows through, the more profit they make. I always have said, you guys have absolutely no incentive in cost containment.
I mean, my question is,
That gets, there I have to ask my
why should
political.
we accept that you can't deal with waste as a given, and why should we accept the insurance model as driving everything? I mean, if we're going to have a system that's affordable and equitable, we have to deal with some of these big issues, and I think waste is a big one that has to be dealt with, or we're going to fail. And I think the unidirectional incentives have to be dealt with, or whatever it comes down to, pike will fail. And my greatest fear is we'll end up with the worst of everything.
Well, just on the waste point, I guess I would challenge your view that there isn't similar amounts of waste in the private sector. We're very aware of waste in the public sector, but I sometimes think about Hollywood. Think of the number of movies, the enormous amount of effort, financial effort, and human capital that goes into movies that are complete flops and that no one ever goes out to see. There's a great deal of waste in the way that we think of it in the healthcare sector throughout our economy. There are lots of products that fail. Businesses, half of small businesses, or what's the number, fail in 3 years. There is tremendous inefficiency and waste everywhere. It's not as apparent to us because we don't take the same scientific lens and look at it, and because we think because we are not paying for it collectively, so we can make individual decisions. One of the big difficulties, I completely agree with you on the unipolar incentives, except that any incentive we structure into the system will create anything we do with the system creates incentives. So the problem is figuring out what the right incentives are, but it's not obvious. It's a complicated design issue and not a simple one. But the last piece, I think, is this Wenberg. The Wenberg literature is terrifically compelling, but also very challenging. We've known for a long time that the processes of care and the quality of care and the cost of care vary across the country. But the interesting experiments are the Mayo Clinic opens a facility, I think in Arizona or Florida, I'm trying to remember. I've talked to Elliot Fisher. Right. It turns out that their facility, operating under Mayo Clinic guidelines and rules in Arizona or wherever it is, behaves like an Arizona hospital, not like the Mayo Clinic. It's very, we have not figured out how you take Minnesota and move it. And I think that actually, in terms of trying to get rid of waste and improve efficiency, that is really challenging. Kaiser, when they moved out of Northern California, were not able to reproduce Kaiser Northern California anywhere else. And that suggests that these problems of how the system works are very deeply embedded and very hard to get at institutionally.
Yeah. I'd like to add to what Sherry said. One of the main strategies for addressing the regional variation, the Wenberg stuff, is the introduction of practice guidelines. Practice guidelines is a kind of protocol for the physician to follow. Well, you have to win physicians to following that protocol. They have to buy into it. Many of them think they've been trained as good doctors and they're going to do the best they can for the individual patient that's in front of them, and their practice pattern may deviate from that practice guideline. So if you actually look at what the task is to change the culture of the practitioners in a particular setting by winning them to a better way to practice. It's very difficult.
Well, I would challenge that a little bit because I've seen it done. Personally, I've organized a group of doctors that did that, but it because the incentives were changed, and the incentives that changed that was that of capitation. Capitation produces incentives that inspire doctors to use their creativity to practice care in a cost-effective, high-quality way. And I've seen that personally with my own eyes because I was involved with it. So the fact that doctors won't change, I think, is probably a good line to take, but I don't think
I agree with you
true.
that you're not going to get the change without a change in a reimbursement structure as well as winning those physicians to it. But it takes both. If you change,
I don't think getting the doctors on board is as difficult as everybody says it.
I actually would agree with that. I disagree with my colleagues who think everything can be run just through reimbursement and appeal to professional norms, because after all, as professors, we have professional norms. We don't get paid piece rate for what we do. So as the chair of this commission on rationalizing New Jersey healthcare, I ran across a guy who has a software that can capture every order entry of every physician for every patient by every input. And he showed me, he did it with the Lovelace Clinic in New Mexico. So this can be done. And I recommended to the governor to make it mandatory for every hospital to have this and to help pay for it. And then have the CEO of the hospital certify that at least once a year or more, every specialty meet that you do profiles of physicians who do cholecystectomies or cabinets and flash them on the board. And there are ways to do this that are non-embarrassing, where the doctor knows who they are, but no one else knows. And sort of say, to what extent could you rely on professional norms when somebody's really an outlier? And I've seen that done at a hospital in Pennsylvania where the variation, sometimes a factor of 2 that they vary. And they then discuss, why am I so high? Well, I use the ICU a lot, or I use antibiotics that are much more expensive than this, and get a collegial discussion. Now, you could reinforce that with capitation, of course. But if you had capitation and you didn't have this data system, all you'd get is a food fight. But if you have this thing, I have some hope that, like you say, physicians can change, that physicians don't just respond to money, that there is such a thing as professional norms, and that maybe we can get at it this way.
I'll make one last comment. In this county, we have, you folks probably remember the PSRO law.
Yeah.
In this county, I was on the board of the PSRO. In fact, I was chairman of the Medical Care Quality Committee. We actually, with that law, were able to change physician behavior in this area by just what you said, by doing profiling and actually, in some instances, bringing in the malfeasant performers and discussing their performance with them.
So, I'd like to know, I had a similar experience with at the University of Michigan hospital. I helped with the cancer program there. We looked at our patients who came here, and the ones who died, who ended up dying, about 50% of them got chemotherapy within the last 2 weeks of life. And I looked at this, and we measured this, and we showed this to my faculty colleagues, and we looked and said, you know, in the private community, it's around 10 or 20% because, you know, you can't tell you're going to be sick, not surprised. And we ended up, when I showed this to my colleagues, the next 2 times we measured it, we were right on the level of the private sector. We had about 20% of people, just like everybody around the country. So I think physician behavior can change. The various disciplines that you recommend, you mentioned capitation and financial incentives. Are there other ways that we might think about changing physician behavior and moving, transplanting what they have more rational clinic to other Los Angeles, Manhattan, where there's a wide disparity other than the financial
I do think that I would reiterate what Uwe said. I think that what we really need to look at is professional norms. And actually, I think that one of the advantages of moving to universal insurance is that we can move the main professional norm, the sort of the professionally good thing that a doctor does, from providing charitable care to improving the quality of care. We can make that the center of professionalism in medicine, not access but quality. And maybe by relying on I think ultimately policymakers have to rely on professionals to do this kind of quality improvement. It can't be a top-down process. No one sitting in Washington can go in and do this beyond the financial incentives. All we can do is put into place the institutions that make the profession choose that as the direction it wants to go.
Yeah, if I could add, I think there are two things that are required institutionally. One is to have the information generated in a way that is effective information, and the other is to have a system of communication and engagement. And in the U.S. healthcare system, because of its fragmentation, you have neither with any reliability. You have pockets here and there, and you have these examples, and you would say, well, it's been demonstrated, why can't it be diffused? There's no one to diffuse it very effectively, and the insurance industry and so on doesn't have the incentives to do so. One of the virtues of other countries, regardless of how they actually organize every single component, is that, one, they are developing the institutions for information gathering in a central way. In the UK, there's NICE, the National Institute for Cost Effectiveness, which is designed to try to develop a national database that allows one to come to some better determination about what works and doesn't. It's not easy, it's certainly controversial, but it's a basis that we don't have. ARC was in a way supposed to do that and never got the opportunity because its agenda was hijacked in some ways early on by Congress, by that particular Congress. But then the second thing is to have a system of, whether it's a single payer or multiple payers, however it's organized, in which there's a common theme about how that information is used, how it's translated into the incentive systems and reimbursement, how it's communicated to physicians, how physicians are bought into the system. One of the great advantages these other systems have had is they have typically developed institutions in which physicians in a very large-scale way had to be engaged directly by payers, whether they're the government or payers acting on behalf of effectively a government-designed system. And that engagement allows for this kind of communication. Again, we do not have that in any institutional forum under the very fragmented system that we have.
I wanted to pick up on your question about the emotional drivers within the system as well, because I think this is a very important issue about clinician or patient demand. I don't think we have a very good mechanism for responding to that in the current situation. And I think that if one built a better understanding of how resources were collective resources that had to be used for a large body of people, we might be able to win some people to changing. But it also takes some kind of process in which people think they're really being listened to, and maybe really are being listened to. And let me tell you one little anecdote which came out of a study that Jim Sabin and I were doing in Blue Cross Blue Shield of California. This goes back to the late 90s. And at that point, there was a lot of controversy about access to certain kinds of bone marrow transplants when the intervention was for a condition that hadn't been fully proven would work. And there were many people who were demanding access to care for their relatives, for themselves, that many of the clinicians thought would be inappropriate. So California Blue Cross Blue Shield made a policy decision that, which was in a lot of ways quite wise. What they did was two things. They put in place an ombudsman who was a nurse, and she was authorized to try to enable families to make a case that there should have been a clinical trial for the kind of condition to see whether it worked for this patient. And that was piggybacked on the other part of their decision, which was they would cover the costs of interventions if they were in clinical trials, so you could find out whether it was really worth doing. And what happened is when they went from a period of enormous litigation, where everybody was threatening to sue and actually suing, to a point where the nurse who dealt with this gave people all kinds of information, showed them what was, tried to help them develop a case that our condition should have been in a clinical trial. And most people who started off demanding the care ended up saying, when all things considered, this is really not for me. And so it might take a combination of institutional structures to try to gradually shape people's understanding of what was good in their individual case, but also the background condition that this is not off the table, but it has to be delivered on grounds that all people can see are reasonable for the delivery of health out of the use of these services. And that's something that could be done at an institutional level. But it takes structures and it takes some leadership on the part of institutions to put that in place. And I don't think that's very common that people are looking for those kinds of solutions.
And, the story that institutions shape values that I've been taught this morning, I wonder if that doesn't also apply to healthcare, that if you go to Dade County in Miami, where they use about 3 times as much, whether part of that is that after years and years of a certain style of medicine, people now demand this medicine. So even if you had a Minnesota physician move in there, he or she would find, my patients really demand this. Because I'm reminded a Harvard MD said his mother called him from Miami and said, I need another MRI. And he said, but Mom, you just had one last month. She says, yes, and I felt so good afterwards. And, there is apparently, I'm told, in Miami now, a culture, particularly of elderly people who are quite demanding. And they had been, in a way, implicitly, or whatever, how that works, they had been taught to demand this style of healthcare. And that is another problem. How to get rid of that is that more difficult even than physicians.
So we have a cultural difference in this state between Southeast Michigan and Lake Grand Rapids.
Really?
Yeah.
So, back there, Nancy, would you go?
Question for Uwe. I'm wondering if you see the issue of addressing social determinants of health as one of Mark's big ideas that can win the hearts and minds of the public, or do you think that addressing the social determinants of health, sort of being explicit about that in policy, might not accomplish what it is important?
Well, I think it might. First of all, we should admit that this idea is actually not that old in our wonkish life. In the Sir Michael Marmot's work was really an eye-opener. People said, geez, how could this be true? And then you saw in Canadian data show consistently that you have this gradient, although they have universal coverage. I think, first of all, we had to learn it, but I do believe at some point one has to engage the media and show this in some way, or somebody has to write a book. I'm sure these people who do the research, or somebody could write a book and just point out to people, healthcare isn't everything. But it was so new to us that many of us are still on healthcare, and we have to justify it with access and health. And it was only because my Princeton colleagues, Christy Paxson, and Steaton, they have these seminars and I go to it, and each time I said, you're killing my marketing case. And remember I said yesterday, therefore I switched and said it's about financial solvency now. That was destroyed this morning by Sherry, so I'm back to dignity. But whatever sells, I'll sell it. But I think this can be done. Maybe Mark can write that book.
Well, this is my time to come in with a big marketing pitch. I'm part of something at UCLA, broader than UCLA, called the Blue Sky Health Initiative, funded by the California Endowment, among others. We've been working, started actually in a hotel room with Al Gore many years ago, in which we decided if we were going to, he wanted to talk about healthcare issues, and we just, as we went through this conversation, it was determined that one more politician talking about healthcare reform at that time, go back to say 2003, wasn't going to add much to the debate. And what would one really do if one were thinking about developing a health system that did what Norm talked about and succeeded at promoting health? And we ended up with this initiative which has three premises. One is that the discussion ought to be about health status. Two, a health system of the 21st century ought to incorporate both the medical and the non-medical determinants of health. And that three, it should also incorporate what we now know about life course development and the effect of risks and prevention and health promotion activities very early in life, including in utero, and how that affects lifetime health status. And what we've been working on is, in fact, trying to come up with what a 21st century health system would look like that had those attributes, how you would solve the silo problem. And we've been playing with ideas that, sort of along the lines that Jean Lambro's written about, but working with the idea of trust, that you would figure out a way of financing that comes from both public and private sources that would go into a trust. Developing some kind of independent decision-making apparatus that would allow decisions to be made without the intervention all the time of politicians. That's one reason why none of these things happen in Congress, is because the Finance Committee in the Senate is the benefits committee, and it all has, it is crazy for U.S. senators who have constituencies to be making these benefit decisions in that way. And we've been trying to figure out how you incorporate public health, population health, and the social determinants of health, the role of health impact assessments to be used in education and transportation and housing, beginning to be used in the city of San Francisco, by the way, in urban development issues. And so we're there. This is our theme. This is what we've been pushing. And so you'll see a lot of us over we hope, the coming year, and some infusion into the Obama process during the campaign and into what we hope now the transition. And in fact, if you look at Obama's health care reform plan in its most recent iteration before the election, and you listen to what Tom Daschle and others have been talking about, it's amazing how much these issues, and others like Paul Lance have been involved in this too, of moving these issues to the fore. Now, there are a whole bunch of friends that I have, not a whole bunch, one friend in particular who doesn't like, not you, Sharon.
Could be me.
But probably two. I'll include one in particular who really doesn't like this idea, and he doesn't like it for purely political reasons.
Who is that?
Joe White.
Okay. No, I'm with Joe.
Yeah, does not like it for political reasons. The argument being, this is a moment to seize the coverage theme. All you're doing is complicating the story, and you're going to give the right wing the freedom to say you don't actually need to provide health insurance coverage because medicine doesn't matter, which is not, of course, what we're saying. And we are also believe universal coverage is an essential part of this process. But there is great controversy about moving in this direction.
They're not mutually exclusive.
No, but I guess I would worry about two aspects. I mean, I'm going to lose my public health affiliation as I say this, but I think there are two dangers in the social determinants of health literature in terms of bringing it into the political healthcare reform process. And this is different from questions like, should we clean up the environment because it's good for people? I think that's a little, I mean, those are very particular, and I think we do want to think about those, but engaging this whole discourse. First of all, there is a very strong, if you take this on, there is a very strong utilitarian case that says healthcare reform goes to the very bottom of the agenda. There are many things you do before healthcare reform to improve people's health. And what's his name at the Cato Institute has been pushing this already. Michael Tanner has been pushing it heavily already, and I think, it's pretty, you actually hear it in your classes. Why are we giving everybody health insurance? They're obese, they smoke cigarettes, they take risks, that's why they're sick. What's the point of health insurance? People should just take care of their own health. That is there is a strong, a compelling story there, and And the public health literature does not help you very much because the health benefits of health insurance are small compared to the health benefits of many other things, including potentially income transfer, which I think is actually the most scary one on this, right? So don't give people health insurance, just give them the money and let them spend it on whatever they want. They're still better off. So if you care about health insurance, this might not be the right way to frame it. The second thing I think actually is a sort of social determinants nihilism, which comes out of Bruce Link and Joe Phelan's work, and for which there is tremendously strong evidence, I think, on many fronts, which is there's something very deep about the social determinants of health that we don't really understand. And when we solve one problem, the social determinants just reappear in some other way. And so that we can spend all of our time dealing with the social determinants of health and still not erase that gradient. And then be just failures forever. That's not a compelling political story either. So, I do think this is the moment to work on health insurance and just get coverage down there, and let's fix everything else later. So I think I'll just stick with Joe White on this one.
In some ways, I agree with the thrust of what Sherry's saying, but I see that as a tactical rather than a strategic point. Strategically, I think one has to educate the public about the broad determinants of health and has to bring those into play. But tactically, I am very concerned because for example, in response to arguments that I've made in the bioethics literature about the importance of the determinants of health, one of the responses has been, well, then we don't need universal coverage because it's not going to be as efficient a way to promote opportunity on my own terms. So I'm quite concerned about that because I think that even if it's true that the health system doesn't contribute as much as pulling some of the other levers are much harder to pull. They're even harder to pull than improving the health system. Evidence, if you look around the world of developed countries, all of which have universal coverage systems, but not ours, they also haven't pulled those other levers in the right ways. So my inference from that is that it's even harder to produce a broader form of social justice than simply meeting this one demand that anybody who needs health care should be able to get it based on needs and not ability to pay. So I'm inclined to think we have to put this first. And I think the other point about this is that the awareness of the importance of the social determinants emerged in contexts where people already had universal coverage. I don't think you could persuade the American public that other things are more important than universal coverage because everybody believes the myth is medicine that cures you and improves population health. So I think that this is a long-term strategy that Mark is engaged in, but that one has to be very careful not to make it tactically backfire. The last point about this is that Uwe mentioned this matrix that I developed with Don Light, a sociologist, for thinking about health reform and evaluating health reform. Well, about 4 or 5 years after that book was written, I adapted this matrix for use in developing countries. And one of the key additions to the matrix that wasn't even present in the whole discussion of American health insurance reform was intersectoral public health. And the recommendation that comes out of the way the benchmarks now works, and this goes back to Uwe's comment about a production function, should there be an agency, was that every health reform ought to try to be intersectoral and engage other sectors of the system in thinking about the impact of their policies on health. And there should be efforts to try to combine them. Whether that requires a combined agency or not, I don't know, because I worry that health is not the tail of justice that should wag the dog. Social justice is important for many other reasons. Education has many other functions than simply improving health, and we all have important reasons for pursuing equity in education, in the distribution of education that go way beyond the impact of education on health. So my picture is that social justice has many dimensions. Whether we could, and ideally the political system is supposed to be the way in which we allocate resources across sectors. And there may be real flaws in our system with its sensitivity to vested interests, to how well it does that compared to some other political arrangements. And so the suggestion that I would start to think about is whether there's a better form of our political institutions to address these kinds of questions.
Just a couple quick things to add, having raised this specter the way I have. One is, actually, other countries are now moving in this direction because they have the other part not solved. Obviously, it's never solved, but it's in place, and so they are doing things along these lines, and they're going to be once again cleaning our clock on these issues down the road. Second of all, it is very much a long-term agenda. It's always been thought of as a long-term agenda, and it's not an agenda for big bill action. But there are a variety of things that one could do consistent with and simultaneous with the movement towards universal coverage. And the third thing is to bring back what you said, Sherry, about dignity, and what Joe White has characterized the healthcare system as one of rescue. And I think it would be, in the end, it would be very hard politically to say that whatever one tries to do to put off that moment of disease and illness, people get sick. And when people get sick, they need care. And it is a violation of dignity. It's a violation of something that's at the core of this American cognitive dissonance, that once they finally do get sick, they ought to be able to get care. So I'm less concerned about that drifting away, because I think the force is so powerful behind it.
Yeah, I think this myth that health care doesn't create health, it's cute and it has some validity to it, but it's a very dangerous thing. I mean, if you have high blood pressure and you take an ACE inhibitor, that works. Mm-hmm. And one should not overdo this thing. Individuals, when they get sick, for the most part, do get relief, and sometimes absolutely magnificent relief.
I'm an orthopedist, and I wanted to bring up a problem we have in orthopedics, particularly now with the burn replacement. There's tremendous pharmaceutical manufacturers, emphasis on tremendous advertising. Marketing very expensive treatments to the patient. When they come to us demanding it, it's very difficult for us to I'm a pediatric orthopedist that treats little kids. We did a study of kids with curvature of the spine that came to see. 60% of those kids had already been on the internet before their first visit. A lot of information that impels treatment. I don't know how to deal with that.
I mean, on the one hand, I've always defended advertising by drug companies because they make a product, they think it's nice. Taking away their freedom to tell you about it is actually a pretty awesome proposition, right? If you make something, if you believe it, you're proud of it, Zimmer comes out with a better joint, why shouldn't they be able to tell you? The problem is that physicians are not equipped to deal with this data. I mean, ideally, they should say, yeah, I saw that ad too, but look, here are the facts as I see them, and a lot of them are not. Now, you can use financial incentives, and that's why you would need somebody like a technology assessment board. Taiwan, for example, pays for a bare metal stent fully, the Taiwan National Single-Payer Health Insurance. But if you want a drug-eluting stent, you pay extra out of pocket. This reference pricing I was talking about. And what the government then did is they posted on the web what each hospital was charging in terms of the extra for each of something like 30 different stent models. And when I saw the first list, it was amazing, the variation. and within 1 year, they collapsed. I mean, the competition there really worked by telling patients, you want this extra thing, you can have it, but there, you know, we socialize a certain level, and beyond that, you really we wouldn't deny you it, but if you have to pay for it. I think ultimately, this reference price system, which Germany uses for drugs very effectively, will be more widely used to cope with these issues. And of course, the other thing is the advertising that the companies put out. It should be meaningful and truthful. That's the FDA. I mean, there were many years when I thought taking a Viagra pill makes you a better race truck car driver. Remember that guy? Who was that? Dale Earnhardt or somebody? Hey, I drive a car better. Because that's all they ever told you about it. So these advertisements should be at least valid, and some of them in the past were not. But outlawing them, I don't know what you other experts here think.
Well, certainly other people who are investigating the impact of direct-to-consumer advertising directly, many of them do believe that the advertising should be outlawed, and it is outlawed in other countries.
It is in most countries.
Yes.
Most not all.
Yeah. So it's, but it does raise the kinds of issues that you were mentioning, Uwe, and I think that makes it much harder to do in the American context. But it is in a world. The other side of it is that it's also enormously expensive, and the irony is that the pharmaceutical industry is spending more on marketing than it is on research, and it's not altogether clear that that's a socially beneficial allocation of resources.
That's an interesting discussion. That's certainly true.
I think there are two sides of this, because pharmaceutical companies market to patients and they also market to physicians, which many people find at least as troubling, because the patient doesn't even know necessarily where the information is coming to the physician from. But the question is, how do we get that information out there? Because I think one of the real disappointments in health policy is that if you don't actively market and disseminate information, physicians do not change their behavior. It actually requires a lot of effort. The beta, if you talk to Elliot Fisher and John Skinner and those guys about the Dartmouth stuff, they come back to beta blockers. And the travesty of the fact that after the trials had been published, they were out in the literature, they were headlined in the medical literature for over a decade. There were very low rates of use of beta blocker because they were off patent. And so nobody was marketing them. Marketing is actually an important part of the process of getting something effective to people, because changing physician behavior is at least as hard as changing patient behavior. So the question is, where do you direct the marketing to? Is it better to direct it exclusively to the providers? Is there a real harm to directing it to the patients? After all, medicine is the only place where when you market to people, they still need to get someone else's permission before they can buy the product. We're willing to market all kinds of things to people and not ask them to get the doctor's sign-off before they can have it. So it does put professionals in a difficult position, but that may not be inappropriate.
All good things must end, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank Uwe and Norm and Sherry and Mark for what I thought was a sort of incredible couple days. So thanks so much.